You must understand, my friends, that love begins suffering the moment the inner feminine is wounded. For she is the bridge between the soul and the world. When I speak of the inner feminine, I do not speak merely of a psychological concept or an abstract archetype that scholars debate over in dim halls. I speak of the living presence within you, the subtle companion who whispers through your instincts, through your longing, through your dreams, through the quiet ache you feel in the center of your chest when love turns into confusion. She is the anima, the breath of your emotional life, the shape of your capacity to love and be loved. And when she is wounded, love becomes distorted, twisted by old memories that were never fully lived, by emotions that were never fully understood, by shadows that were never fully brought into the light. Many of you come to me with the same question: why does love hurt so much? Even when I mean well, why does the heart, which is meant to open, tighten instead? And I tell you, gently, love hurts when the inner feminine has been asked to carry a burden she was never meant to bear. The burden of your parents' unlived emotions, the burden of society's expectations, the burden of your own fear of vulnerability. These burdens crush her delicate wings, and so she closes herself, not out of malice, but out of self-protection. Yet when she closes, love cannot flow. And when love cannot flow, the psyche compensates by creating illusions, projections, fantasies, and attachments that hurt more than they heal. Perhaps you have noticed how you fall in love not with a person, but with a dream. This is the anima reaching out, seeking completion through the outer world. She does not show you the other as they are. She shows you the reflection of your own wound. You think you are loving them, but you are in fact attempting to meet the exiled parts of yourself through their presence. When that person departs or fails to match the image, you feel betrayed. But the betrayal belongs to the image, not the person. This is why I have always said, we never truly fall in love with another human being. We fall in love with our own unconscious, and until you heal the inner feminine, you will continue to confuse the two. Let me tell you of a patient, a young woman whose eyes shimmered with both innocence and exhaustion. She came to me saying she could no longer bear the pain of loving men who left her feeling invisible. She said she offered them her whole heart, yet somehow she always became the one abandoned, the one diminished, the one carrying the weight of their chaos. I asked her to speak of her earliest memories, and as she spoke, a dream revealed itself. In her dream, she was standing at the edge of a vast lake, and beneath the water she saw the faint glow of a woman's face. Each time she tried to reach for this face, the water darkened and swallowed the image. She awoke with tears on her cheeks. This dream, I explained, was the language of her inner feminine. The woman beneath the surface was herself, her true emotional nature, submerged too long beneath the needs of others. Every man she loved was merely a shadow cast across the water. A figure walking above a wound she had never dared to enter, and so she loved with desperation, because she feared that if she stopped reaching for them, she would have to face the lake itself. And the lake, in dreams, always represents the unconscious, deep, vast, silent, and demanding honesty. She had mistaken attachment for love because her anima was trapped beneath old memories of being unseen by her father, who spoke in loud authority but never learned the art of tenderness. The girl had grown, but the wound remained young. Healing the inner feminine requires the courage to enter this lake. You must descend into the feelings you avoid, the memories you dismiss, the grief you think is too old to matter. Nothing in the unconscious is ever too old. It waits with a patience that rivals eternity. And when you finally descend, you are not descending into darkness, but into the part of you that has been waiting to be acknowledged. The anima does not ask for perfection. She asks for presence. She asks for honesty. She asks for the courage to feel what you have silenced. Until you do this, every relationship will become a battleground between what you consciously want and what your unconscious demands. The inner feminine also governs intuition, and many empaths tell me that their intuition becomes unreliable or even overwhelming when they are wounded. This is unsurprising. A wounded anima does not whisper gently, she cries, she storms. She amplifies every sensation in order to demand your attention. You may mistake this for emotional intensity or spiritual sensitivity, but often it is simply the psyche screaming through the channels available to it. When you heal her, intuition becomes calm again, deep, rooted, and trustworthy. Your emotional body begins to speak in coherent language rather than in the fragmented cries of past trauma. Consider another dream. A man once told me he dreamt of a forest at night, where he followed a faint trail lit by fireflies. Behind every tree, he sensed a presence watching him, a woman, he thought, but her face was always hidden by shadows. He feared her at first, thinking she might be a ghost, but eventually he felt more curiosity than fear, and when he turned to face her, she stepped forward, revealing not terror, but sorrow. Her eyes were familiar. They belonged to his mother, not the mother he knew, but the mother who existed only in memory, the mother whose sadness he had absorbed as a child without ever understanding it. This dream was an encounter with the inner feminine in her sorrowful form. The forest was the unconscious, the fireflies, the sparks of intuition leading him towards self-understanding, and the woman was the grief he inherited but never acknowledged. Every time he entered a relationship, he expected his partner to soothe this grief. When they could not, he blamed them or withdrew emotionally. Love hurt him, not because it was flawed, but because it touched the wound he refused to face. When he finally allowed himself to feel his mother's sadness rather than carry it blindly, The dream returned, but this time the woman extended her hand, and he did not fear her. This was the beginning of healing. To heal the inner feminine, you must learn to see emotion not as weakness, but as a guide. You must learn to meet your own vulnerability before expecting another to hold it. You must understand that the anima is not merely a symbol, she is a living rhythm within you. When she is whole, you do not cling. You do not fear abandonment. You do not confuse intensity with love. You love from a place of inner fullness rather than inner hunger. And that is when love stops hurting, when the empath heals the inner feminine, something extraordinary happens. You stop absorbing the emotional chaos of others. You stop confusing someone else's suffering with your responsibility. You stop mistaking, rescuing for loving. The reason you have carried so much pain is not because you are too sensitive, it is because your inner feminine, wounded and unprotected, has been leaking energy into every emotional encounter, hoping that by giving enough, she might one day be seen. But healing teaches her a new way. It teaches her that she does not need to bleed to feel worthy. She does not need to sacrifice herself to feel connected. She does not need to carry the emotional world on her shoulders to prove she is good. When she rises healed, she becomes your inner queen, not your inner orphan. She becomes the part of you that chooses love without abandoning yourself. And when she stands in her rightful place, love no longer wounds you, it enlightens you, it deepens you, it becomes an act of soul recognition rather than a repetition of childhood longing. And so, my dear friends, when we speak of healing the inner feminine, we are not speaking of an abstract ideal floating somewhere above your life. We are speaking of a return, a descent, a reconciliation with the forgotten chambers of your emotional reality. You cannot heal her by reading theories or repeating affirmations. You heal her by listening, by witnessing, by granting her the dignity of your presence. She has waited for you in your dreams, in your relationships, in the silent tremor under your ribs. When someone touches a wound you pretend no longer exists. She has waited with the patience only the unconscious can sustain, patient because she knows that whether you acknowledge her or not, she is part of the architecture of your soul. Many empaths misunderstand the source of their suffering. They think they are broken because they feel too much. They believe they are weak because they collapse under the weight of emotions that others seem to handle with ease. But sensitivity is not the cause of suffering. It is the lens through which the wound is magnified. A healed inner feminine amplifies intuition, compassion, and emotional clarity. A wounded one amplifies fear, longing, and projection. The empath feels the wound more intensely, not because the wound is larger, but because their psyche was designed to register subtle vibrations. When the inner feminine is in pain, those vibrations become earthquakes. Imagine your psyche as a temple in which the inner feminine is the central flame, when she burns steadily, the light touches every corner of the self, illuminating the shadows without overwhelming you. But when she flickers, when the flame sputters or consumes itself too quickly, the temple becomes filled with smoke. You see shapes where there are none. You misinterpret intentions. You fall in love with illusions or shrink from love entirely. You internalize others' emotions as if they were your own. And you do this not because you lack discernment, but because the flame guiding your vision has lost its steadiness. There is a story from one of my patients, a man who believed himself cursed because every romantic connection ended in emotional disaster. He said he attracted only partners who were lost, damaged, or chaotic, and he insisted that this pattern must be an external fate imposed upon him by life. But fate is rarely external. It is the unconscious arranging your encounters with uncanny precision. When he finally explored his dreams, a recurring symbol appeared, a bird with a broken wing perched on a windowsill. Each time he tried to help this bird, it pecked at his hand or flew away, leaving him with nothing but the memory of the wound. This bird was his inner feminine, broken not by malice but by neglect. His childhood was filled with a mother whose emotions were unpredictable, who oscillated between tenderness and despair. As a boy, he had learned to become her emotional caretaker, believing that love meant stabilizing another's chaos. This pattern became the blueprint for all his adult relationships. He kept choosing partners who mirrored his mother's instability because his anima was still trapped in the past, reenacting the only form of love she knew. Once he understood this, he wept not for the failed relationships, but for the child within himself who had tried so hard to earn affection from those incapable of offering it consistently. Healing the inner feminine requires this kind of grief, a grief not directed at the world, but inward, at the parts of yourself that have been sacrificed to survive. You must grieve the years you spent loving people who could not meet you, the years you believed you needed to be small, to be accepted, the years your emotional life was shaped by circumstances you did not choose. This grief is sacred. It is the baptism of the soul in its own truth. Without it, transformation is impossible. When an empath finally allows this grief, the entire structure of their inner world begins to shift. Boundaries, once impossible to maintain, start forming naturally, not out of fear, but out of self-respect. Emotional entanglements dissolve because they no longer serve the wounded parts of the psyche. The inner feminine, once trembling and overextended, begins to rise with quiet confidence. She stops whispering and starts speaking. She stops blending into others' emotions and starts distinguishing her own. She becomes a presence rather than an echo. And when this happens, the nature of love itself changes. You must understand that the inner feminine does not love from fear. She loves from knowing. When she is healed, she does not chase, she does not cling, She does not collapse into the emotional gravity of another person. She sees clearly. She recognizes not only the beauty in another's soul, but also the limitations. She no longer confuses potential with reality. She understands that love is not the merging of wounds, but the recognition of two separate individuals meeting with awareness. This clarity does not make love colder, it makes it deeper, more grounded, more capable of enduring. Many of you have mistaken emotional intensity for intimacy. This confusion arises from the wounded Anima's hunger for validation. Unpredictable emotions, inconsistent affection, or dramatic encounters seem meaningful because they activate the old wounds that have shaped your understanding of connection. But this is not love. It is reenactment. It is the psyche searching for resolution through repetition. When the inner feminine is healed, this intensity no longer seduces you. You begin to prefer emotional steadiness over chaos, genuine presence over dramatic longing, truth over fantasy. Let me give you another dream image, one that often arises in those who are healing their inner feminine. A woman dreams of walking through a desert. She's thirsty, exhausted, and desperate for water. Suddenly, she sees an oasis shimmering in the distance, but as she approaches, the oasis dissolves. It was a mirage. She collapses in despair. Then, as the dream continues, she looks beneath her feet and discovers a small spring of fresh water emerging from the ground. Unnoticed until the illusion disappeared, she drinks from it and feels restored. This dream beautifully illustrates the psychological process. The oasis is the emotional fantasy projected outward. The true water, the inner source of love, only becomes visible once the illusion is surrendered. Healing the inner feminine brings your attention to this internal spring. You begin to realize that love does not come from outside, but radiates outward from the core of your being. When you drink from this internal spring, you no longer feel starved in relationships. You no longer seek partners to rescue you from loneliness. You carry your own oasis within you. Another important aspect of the inner feminine is her connection to creativity and imagination. When she is wounded, the imagination becomes distorted, consumed by fear, overthinking, and intrusive fantasies. You imagine abandonment long before it happens. You create narratives of rejection before anyone has even spoken. This is not intuition. It is a wounded anima projecting the past into the future. But when she heals, imagination becomes a tool for growth rather than a prison. You begin to envision possibilities instead of catastrophes. You dream in symbols that guide you rather than torment you. You create art, meaning, and beauty because the inner feminine, restored to her fullness, is the artist of the psyche. Let us return for a moment to the nature of shadow. The inner feminine does not exist in isolation. She is intertwined with the shadow the parts of the psyche you reject or fear. Many of you hide your most vulnerable emotions in the shadow because you believe they make you weak or unlovable. You hid your longing, your need for affection, your fear of abandonment, but the shadow is not a grave. It is a waiting room. Everything you hide waits there patiently until you are ready to reclaim it. And the Anima is the one who leads you into this room. When she is wounded, she becomes afraid of her own shadow. When she is healed, she becomes a guide. Healing the inner feminine requires a willingness to face the shadow with tenderness rather than judgment. You must learn to look at your own insecurity without shame, your own dependency without self-hatred, your own longing without mockery. When the inner feminine feels safe with your honesty, she reveals her true power. She transforms emotional fragility into emotional wisdom. She helps you distinguish between intuition and fear, between love and trauma, between connection and attachment. And finally, I must tell you this: when the inner feminine is healed, you become capable of receiving love, not just giving it. Many empaths know how to give love endlessly, but they do not know how to receive it without fear, suspicion, or guilt. Receiving love requires trust. It requires the belief that you are worthy of being seen without having to earn it. It requires softness, surrender, and the courage to allow yourself to be held by another. This is the ultimate transformation of the Anima. She becomes not the child seeking protection, but the woman who knows she is deserving of gentle affection. And now, let us move deeper into the mystery, for the healing of the inner feminine is not merely a psychological adjustment, it is a return to an ancient rhythm within the soul. When she rises, something in you remembers what it means to be whole. You may not have words for it, you may not fully understand it, but you feel it in the way your heart softens without collapsing, the way your intuition becomes clear without shaking you, the way your presence grounds instead of dissolving into the emotions of others. This is the transformation that occurs when you bring to consciousness what has long lived in the shadows of your emotional life. To heal her, you must understand what wounded her in the first place. For most people, the wound begins not in adulthood, but in childhood. When the first template of love is formed, the child looks to the mother as the first embodiment of the feminine principle. She is the mirror in which the child sees their emotional worth. If this mirror is stable, reflective, and responsive, the inner feminine grows with grace. But if the mirror is clouded, inconsistent, or fragile, the child learns to adapt rather than to feel. They learn to please rather than express. They learn to hide rather than reveal. And the Anima, still young and undeveloped, absorbs these distortions as truths about love. But the mother is not the only influence. The father too plays a role, for he shapes the relational space in which the feminine is received If the father cannot hold emotion, the child internalizes the belief that their emotional nature is too much, too chaotic, too inconvenient. And so the inner feminine begins to shrink, to silence herself, to become cautious. She learns to whisper instead of sing. This silence becomes the root of adult suffering. You think you are afraid of losing love, but what you truly fear is the return of this childhood silence, the sense that your emotions will not be met, that your voice will echo unanswered. The empath especially carries this wound in a heightened form because many empaths grew up sensing the emotional landscapes of their parents long before they understood their own. They absorbed grief, fear, disappointment, anger, and unspoken tension as if it belonged to them. Their inner feminine became vigilant rather than receptive. She learned to listen for danger rather than for intimacy. And so, in adulthood, the empath often confuses emotional responsibility with love. They think that love means anticipating others' needs, absorbing others' suffering, or stabilizing others' emotions. But that is not love. That is survival masquerading as devotion. When an empath begins healing the inner feminine, the first thing they notice is a strange sensation, the quiet, not the cold silence of neglect, but a sacred quiet, a quiet of returning energy, of releasing what was never theirs to carry. They begin to discern the boundary between self and other. They stop confusing emotional intuition with emotional obligation. They realize that just because they feel another person's pain does not mean they must heal it. This is the beginning of liberation. The empath who once dissolved into others' emotions becomes capable of remaining whole within the presence of another. Some of you may fear that this healing will make you less loving, less compassionate, less connected, but the opposite is true. A healed inner feminine loves more deeply, not less. She loves with clarity instead of confusion, with presence instead of panic, with discernment instead of desperation. She does not lose herself in love, she finds herself there. And when you are fully present, love becomes a doorway to the divine rather than a battlefield of unmet needs. Let us return to the symbolic language of dreams, for the unconscious speaks in images long before it speaks in words. One woman told me of a dream where she was standing in a grand cathedral. The ceiling rose so high, it disappeared into shadow. In the center of this cathedral was a statue of a woman carved from marble, cracked in several places but still standing with quiet dignity. As the woman approached the statue, the cracks began to glow with soft light, as if the wounds were becoming luminescent rather than destructive. She awoke in tears, overwhelmed by the beauty of the image. This dream is a perfect representation of healing. The inner feminine does not become whole by erasing the wounds. She becomes whole by illuminating them. The cracks become part of her radiance. The pain becomes part of her wisdom. The vulnerability becomes part of her strength. This is the paradox of the psyche. What you reject becomes your burden. What you embrace becomes your power. When she recognized the cracks in the statue, she recognized herself strong, not because she was untouched by life, but because she survived it with her essence intact. Another recurring symbol in dreams of the healing Anima is the appearance of water that shifts from chaos to clarity. In early dreams, water is often turbulent, murky, or threatening waves crashing, rivers flooding, lakes concealing unknown depths. But as healing progresses, the water becomes still, clear, reflective. This is no coincidence. Water is the element of the feminine, the embodiment of emotion, fluidity, memory, and intuition. When your emotional life is wounded, the water in your dreams becomes stormy. As you heal, it becomes calm, and when the water is calm, you can see your reflection clearly. Many people fear this reflection. They fear discovering that the image they have projected to the world, the strong one, the healer, the rescuer, the giver, does not match the image reflected back to them. But healing requires honesty. You must be willing to meet the self you have avoided. You must be willing to look beneath the persona, the mask you wear for survival, and meet the soul that longs for authenticity. The inner feminine does not care about your performance. She cares about your truth. When you finally see yourself clearly, a profound shift occurs. You stop seeking love that wounds you. You stop repeating old patterns. You stop choosing partners based on the familiar ache of childhood. You begin choosing based on resonance rather than repetition. And in this shift, something else awakens, the inner masculine. For the psyche is not complete without the interplay of both the feminine and masculine principles. When the inner feminine heals, she summons the inner masculine to rise as well. He is the boundary maker, the protector of the heart, the bringer of clarity. Without him, the inner feminine remains vulnerable. With him, she becomes empowered. This inner marriage, the union of the feminine and masculine within, is the foundation of all mature love. Until this union occurs, relationships remain imbalanced. You seek externally what you lack. Internally, you rely on others to play the roles your own psyche has not yet developed. But when the inner feminine and inner masculine integrate, you become capable of relating from wholeness. You no longer demand from others what you have denied yourself. You become capable of loving without losing your center. This transformation often appears in dreams as the meeting of a woman and a man in symbolic form, sometimes as lovers, sometimes as adversaries, sometimes as companions on a journey. When the inner feminine is wounded, these figures remain separated, conflicted, or distorted. When she heals, the figures move toward one another. They speak, they share, they reconcile. This symbolic union marks the beginning of emotional maturity, the end of projection, and the birth of authentic intimacy. Let me share another dream from a patient, a man who spent years sabotaging relationships because he feared vulnerability. He dreamt of a wide field at dusk. In the center stood a woman dressed in white, her back turned to him. As he approached, he saw a man standing beside her. Holding her hand, jealousy surged through him. But when the man turned, he realized the man was himself, not his waking self. Buddha Kalmer, Visa Version. The dream stunned him. He understood instantly. He had been searching for the feminine outside when she had been calling for him to develop the masculine within. His task was not to chase love, but to become the version of himself capable of receiving it. Healing the inner feminine also changes the way you experience solitude. What once felt like loneliness becomes a sanctuary. You find comfort in your own presence because your emotional life is no longer fragmented. You begin to enjoy the quiet moments when nothing demands your attention. You feel a sense of inner companionship, as if a soft presence walks beside you even when you are alone. This is the Anima restored. She becomes your muse, your guide, your emotional compass. She no longer cries out from the depths, she speaks from the center. And the final transformation, the one most people never expect, is that your relationships begin to reflect your healing. You no longer attract cows because cows no longer feels familiar. You no longer tolerate manipulation because your self-worth has risen. You no longer lose yourself in love because your inner masculine holds the container steady. People who once drained you lose their hold. People who resonate with your wholeness begin to appear. Life arranges itself around your new emotional frequency. Love stops hurting, not because the world changes, but because you do. And now, as we arrive at the final threshold of this inner journey, I invite you to listen not only with your mind, but with the quiet places beneath your ribs, the regions of yourself that respond not to logic but to resonance. Healing the inner feminine is not the end of suffering. It is the end of unnecessary suffering. It is the beginning of an emotional life rooted in truth, rather than in the echoes of unresolved childhood longing. When she rises healed, the entire psyche reorients itself, because the inner feminine governs the currents of meaning that flow through your relationships, your dreams, your intuition, and your sense of belonging in the world. Do not underestimate this transformation. When the inner feminine awakens, she does not simply soften you. She awakens a depth of soul perception that you may have forgotten you possessed. You begin to see not only the outer forms of people, but their inner landscapes. You sense the difference between authenticity and performance. You notice when someone speaks from their essence and when they speak from their wound. You recognize patterns of trauma not with judgment, but with clarity. This clarity is not cold, it is compassionate. It does not entangle you, it frees you. One of the greatest illusions of modern life is the belief that love comes from outside. People chase it, cling to it, fear losing it, and distort themselves to maintain it. But once the inner feminine is healed, you understand the deeper truth. Love is a lens. not an achievement. It is a way of seeing, and the clarity of this lens depends on the condition of your inner world. When she is wounded, you see others through the fog of unmet needs. When she heals, you see others as they truly are. And, more importantly, you see yourself as you truly are. Many empaths spend years believing their pain comes from loving too deeply. But the true pain comes from the unconscious hope that someone else will heal the wound they cannot face. When this hope dissolves not with despair, but with understanding, you reclaim your power. You stop waiting for someone to choose you in the way your parents could not. You stop seeking emotional safety in people who resemble your earliest wounds. You stop trying to earn affection by diminishing yourself. This is not a loss of innocence. It is the birth of inner authority. There is a particular dream that often appears at the final stage of healing, a dream symbolizing the rebirth of the anima. A person dreams of descending into a dark cave, frightened yet compelled. At the bottom of this cave lies a pool of still water. When they look into it, they expect to see monsters, shadows, or ghosts of their past, but instead they see themselves not the wounded self, but the emerging self, calm and luminous. The cave, once feared, becomes a sanctuary. The water, once avoided, becomes a mirror, and the darkness, once oppressive, becomes a womb of transformation. This dream marks the moment when the unconscious is no longer an enemy but an ally. The inner feminine, once hidden beneath layers of unexpressed emotion, now sits at center of your being like a queen returned to her throne. Her presence changes the quality of your emotional life. You no longer panic when someone withdraws, because you no longer confuse absence with abandonment. You no longer collapse when someone criticizes you, because you no longer mistake critique for rejection. You no longer rush to fix others' problems, because you understand that emotional over-responsibility is not love, but self-erasure. One man I worked with spent decades oscillating between emotional numbness and emotional overwhelm. He thought of himself as broken, but slowly, as his inner feminine healed, he began to sense something new, emerging an inner steadiness, a groundedness that was not dependent on external validation. He told me one day that he woke in the morning and for the first time felt a quiet contentment, not tied to achievement, relationships, or praise. It startled him. He had always believed inner peace was a mythical concept reserved for monks or saints, but peace is simply the natural state of a psyche no longer at war with itself. This peace, however, is not passive. It is an active harmony, a conscious partnership between the inner feminine and the inner masculine. Without the masculine, the feminine remains vulnerable, easily overwhelmed. Without the feminine, the masculine becomes rigid, cold, disconnected. Healing the inner feminine often catalyzes the integration of the inner masculine, who steps forward not as a tyrant, But as an ally, he provides structure, discernment, boundaries, and clarity. She provides intuition, emotional depth, creativity, and relational wisdom. Together they create balance. Together they create the conditions for authentic love. In this balance, something extraordinary becomes possible. You begin to choose relationships consciously rather than unconsciously. You no longer follow the gravitational pull of old wounds. You no longer feel intoxicated by people who activate your survival patterns. Instead, you feel drawn to those whose presence resonates with your authentic self. This kind of love is not a whirlwind or a collision. It is a meeting, a recognition, a mutual unfolding. It feels safe, not because it lacks intensity, but because it does not feed on the instability of your past. This is the moment when empaths often tell me they feel a strange unfamiliarity with themselves. They say, I don't feel like the old me anymore. I don't react the same way. I don't feel the same magnetic pull to people who once captivated me. And I tell them, that is because the old you was shaped by your wound, not your wisdom. Healing the inner feminine does not change your sensitivity. It changes the meaning of your sensitivity. It becomes a gift instead of a burden. You sense more, but you feel less. You feel deeply, but with grounding rather than collapse. You love strongly, but with boundaries rather than enmeshment. Now let us speak of the final transformation, the one that marks the completion of the healing cycle, the shift from projection to presence. Projection is the unconscious attempt to heal yourself through another person. You look at someone and unconsciously place upon them the qualities you long for: safety, affection, validation, purpose. This is why early love often feels so intoxicating. It is not the other you are seeing, but the archetypal image rising from within you. But projection is temporary. When it dissolves, you feel disillusioned, disappointed, or betrayed, not because the other changed, but because the image faded. Presence is different. Presence allows you to meet another person without distorting them through the lens of unmet needs. Presence allows you to see their strengths without idealizing them, their flaws, without fearing them, their humanity, without confusing it for danger. Presence is only possible when the inner feminine is healed, because presence requires emotional safety within the self. When you no longer fear your own feelings, you no longer fear intimacy. When you no longer fear abandonment, you no longer cling. When you no longer fear rejection, you no longer hide. Presence is the purest form of love, and this is where all healing leads to the ability to love without losing yourself and to be loved without losing your integrity. The empath who once suffered under the weight of emotional absorption becomes a beacon of stability. They attract people who respect their boundaries, who value their depth, who are capable of meeting them in the sacred space where two souls speak without words. The empath becomes not a sponge, but a mirror, not an absorber, but a witness, not a rescuer, but a partner. When the inner feminine heals, love stops hurting, not because love becomes perfect, but because you stop approaching it from a place of unconscious pain. You stop reenacting old dynamics. You stop abandoning yourself. You stop looking to others to heal wounds they did not create, and in doing so, you reclaim the one thing you have always longed for, the sense of being emotionally at home within yourself. So I leave you with this truth, spoken not from doctrine but from experience, healing. The inner feminine is the reawakening of the soul's original harmony. She is not a concept. She is a presence. She is not a symbol. She is a rhythm. She is not a theory. She is your emotional life in its most authentic form. And when you return to her, when you listen to her, when you honor her, you do not become someone new. You become who you always were beneath the layers of survival. When the empath heals the inner feminine, love does not disappear. It transforms, it clarifies, it deepens, it expands, and finally, it becomes something it has never been before, a source of strength instead of suffering, a teacher instead of a tormentor, a path instead of a prison. When the inner feminine rises, you rise with her.